The first chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Chosen Undead begins within the stagnant isolation of the Northern Undead Asylum. This is the narrative systemic segregation, where the physical architecture of the world, the cold stone cells and iron bars, serves as a filter for a decaying civilization. Within the flickering torchlight and the mellowed moans of the forgotten, the world witnessed the institutionalization of the dark sign. The lore of this era is the lore of the hollowed threshold. Its purpose was the containment of the biological anomaly. The history of the asylum is the history of the Great Quarantine, where those who refused to die were huddled in the frozen north to await the end of the world. This is the tragedy of the infinite sentence, proving that immortality is a curse that attracts the cage to the spirit. The lore of the dark sign and the branding of humanity provides the biological foundation for this chapter's despair. As the first flame faded, a circle of fire appeared on the flesh of men, representing the return of the primal dark that the gods fear. The lore suggests that the dark sign is a leech of identity. Its purpose was the forced regression of the human form. By stripping the undead of their reason and soul through repeated deaths, the sign turns the subject into a hollow, showing that life without ending is a cessation of self. This reveals the malignant purpose of the brand. The gods ensured that man would forget his nature before he could usurp the throne. This was the era of the Dark Ring. This shows that the history of the undead is a history of the erosion, which grinds the individual into dust. The physical environment of the Undead Asylum provides insight into the theological despair of the fall. This is a monastery of the damned tucked away in the mountains, representing the religious justification for exile. The lore of the asylum demon explains that its purpose was the final guardian of the gate. By stationing a colossal beast of the old chaos to watch the cells, the authorities proved that escape was theologically impossible, showing that fate is a solid door. This reveals the terminal purpose of the prison. The undead are not patients, they are artifacts of a broken age waiting for the void. This was the era of the crushing hammer. This shows that the history of the asylum is a history of the stagnation, which freezes the cycle in a room of iron. The relationship between Oscar of Astora and the transmission of the prophecy represents the noble delusion within the fall. A knight from a land of honor breaks the roof of your cell to deliver a key, representing the projection of hope onto a blank canvas. The lore suggests that the prophecy is a calculated fabrication. Its purpose was the guidance of the cursed toward a predetermined sacrifice. By telling Kratos, or in this case, the undead, that a chosen will leave the asylum to succeed the gods, Oscar proved that even the dying need a story to motivate the legs. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the rescue. The knight dies so the prophecy can live in the subject. This was the era of the elite knight armor. The history of Oscar is the history of the catalyst, which ignites the fire of ambition in a corpse. Furthermore, the lore of the Great Raven and the Divine Transit represents the cosmic intervention within the fall. After defeating the asylum demon, a giant black bird carries the undead away to Lordran, representing the interest of higher powers in the subject's journey. The lore suggests that the raven is the messenger of Velka or Gwyn. Its purpose was the physical relocation of the pawn to the game board. By lifting the cursed from their grave, the bird proved that the asylum was only the beginning of the harvest. This reveals the predatory purpose of the escape. The undead is not free. They are simply moving to a larger arena. This was the era of the Snuggly the Crow. The relationship between the Estus flask and the borrowed vitality represents the parasitic sustenance within the fall. The undead drinks the flame to heal wounds, representing the temporary delay of the inevitable hollowing. The lore suggests that Estus is the fluid of the bonfire, Its purpose was the mechanical binding of the undead to the first flame. This reveals the dependent purpose of the journey. The warrior cannot exist outside the system that exiled him. This was the era of the Emerald Flask. This shows that the history of the Estus is a history of the fuel, which burns the will to keep the body moving. The lore of the first bonfire and the anchor of the soul represents the spiritual checkpoint within the narrative. The undead coils their will around the sword embedded in the ash, proving that rest is found only in the consumption of resources. The lore suggests that the bonfire is a fragment of the sun. Its purpose was the anchoring of the transient being to the material reality. By resting at the flames, the undead confirmed their status as a subject of the lordship, showing that the dark within must be balanced by the fire without. This reveals the ritualistic purpose of the stay. The gods created islands of light in a sea of rot. The act concludes with the silent observation of the crow's arrival at Firelink, realizing that the asylum was merely a cocoon for the terror that is about to unfold. The purpose of the Undead Asylum lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the initial freedom. It shows that escaping the cell is not escaping the system. The player realizes that Lordran is a throne that craves flesh. The rise of the undead is the final movement of the Asylum lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, escape is not a rescue. It is a recruitment into a war that was lost before the key was turned. The legacy of the Asylum in this chapter is the horror of the systemic segregation. We realize that Providence was a bloody lie and hope was a tether that the gods used to anchor the curse to the reality of their own combustion. The purpose of the Workshop of the Grave was to inventory the hunger, and the fall was the acceptance of the quest. As the wings of the raven block the sun, and the undead gazes at the ruins of Firelink, hearing the crackling of the first embers echoing through the valley, they understand that the history of Lordran is the history of the fuel, a fuel that burns the innocent to maintain the shadow of the guilty. The second chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Chosen Undead documents the vertical ascent through the skeletal remains of human civilization. This is the narrative architectural stratification, where the physical architecture of the world, the crumbling ramparts of the undead burg and the soaring spires of the undead parish, represents the social hierarchy of a dying age. Within the narrow walkways and the shadow of the parish clock, the undead witnesses the physical decay of order. The lore of this era is the lore of the trial of the ascent. Its purpose was the verification of the undead's martial prowess. The history of the burg is the history of the urban graveyard, where the former soldiers of Lordran rot into mindless husks while clinging to the duty of guarding a city of corpses. This is the tragedy of the Hollowed Guard, proving that service without soul is a mechanism that never stops. The lore of the Bell of Awakening and the Call to the Gods provides the theological foundation for this chapter's movement. Perched atop the parish, the first bell serves as a sonic beacon, representing the activation of the undead's divine status. The lore suggests that the bell is a sifting tool. Its purpose was the separation of the worthy from the dross. By ringing the steel, the undead announces their presence to the lords of Aner Londo, showing that ambition must be audible to be recognized. This reveals the echoing purpose of the parish. The gods created a noise to wake the slayer. This was the era of the bronze toll. This shows that the history of the bell is a history of the signal, which turns a pilgrimage into a challenge. The physical environment of the undead burg provides insight into the guerrilla hopelessness of the fall. This is a vertical slum designed for defense, but now infested with feral undead, representing the internal collapse of the Gwyn's police force. The lore of the Black Knights explains that its purpose was the remnant presence of the old war. These disembodied soldiers wander the burg as living statues, proving that the past never leaves the battlefield. This reveals the static purpose of the city. The burg is a labyrinth built to grind the challenger before they reach the heavens. This was the era of the hardened shield. This shows that the history of the Berg is a history of the obstacle, which uses urban decay as a filter. The relationship between Solaire of Astora and the Fellowship of the Sun represents the luminous delusion within the fall. A warrior who seeks his own sun offers cooperation, representing the last sliver of optimism in a world of shadow. The lore suggests that Solaire is the mirror of the unyielding will. Its purpose was the introduction of the summoning logic. By scribing the sign on the ground, Solaire proved that undead can connect through the flow of time, showing that isolation is a choice. This reveals the radiant purpose of the warrior of sunlight. The sun is a metaphor for the sanity held in the face of the abyss. This was the era of the sunlight metal. The history of Solaire is the history of the companion, who burns brightly to hide the dark. Furthermore, the lore of the Bell Gargoyles and the Guardians of the Threshold represents the inorganic surveillance within the fall. These stone sentinels animate to prevent the ringing of the bell, representing the gods' distrust of the chosen. The lore suggests that gargoyles are divine automatons. Their purpose was the final quality control of the parish. By fighting in tandem, the beasts proved that power requires adaptability, showing that the threshold demands a sacrifice of skill. This reveals the judicial purpose of the roof. The gods do not open the door, they wait to see if you can break it. This was the era of the halberd. The relationship between the channelers and the surveillance of the archive represents the intellectual subjugation within the fall. Trident-wielding sorcerers from the Duke's archives observe the undead from the balconies, representing the interest of Seth the Scaleless in the undead's biology. The lore suggests that channelers are eyes of the dragon. Its purpose was the data collection of the hollowing process. This reveals the scientific purpose of the Berg's infestation. The undead are not just pilgrims, they are research subjects for a mad scholar. This was the era of the six-eyed mask. The lore of the first shortcut and the recursive geometry represents the spatio-temporal collapse within the narrative. By kicking a ladder or riding an elevator back to Firelink Shrine, the undead bridges the distance, proving that the world is shrinking. The lore suggests that the shortcut is the geometry of despair. Its purpose was the consolidation of the undead's focal point. By linking the parish to the fire, the undead confirmed that the shrine is the axis of their existence, showing that the journey is a spiraling descent into centrality. This reveals the efficient purpose of the design. The land folds inward to keep the sacrifice close. The act concludes with the silent observation of the ringing bell, hearing the vibration travel through the valley to the second bell in the depths, realizing that the sky is now open, but the earth is still closed. The purpose of the Bell of Awakening lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the ascent. It shows that gravity is the enemy of divinity. The player realizes that ringing the bell is a declaration of war against silence. The rise of the pilgrim is the final movement of the Berg lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, progress is not a walk, it is a climb that exhausts the lungs to satisfy the heavens. The legacy of the parish in this chapter is the horror of the architectural stratification. We realize that excellence was a bloody requirement and duty was a tether that the lords used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own usefulness. The purpose of the workshop of the parish was to measure the ambition, and the fall was the ringing of the signal. As the sun glints off the bell, and the undead looks down at the Berg, hearing the rattle of the hollows echoing through the walls, they understand that the history of the parish is the history of the filter, a filter that allows the strong to burn but leaves the weak to choke in the shadow of the tower. The third chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Chosen Undead documents the subterranean digression into the bowels of the world. This is the narrative biological abjection, where the physical architecture of Lordran, the clogged sewers of the depths and the slippery stone of the lower berg, represents the metabolic waste of the god's kingdom. Within the rancid water and the infinite dark of the drains, the undead witnesses the physical corruption of the flesh. The lore of this era is the lore of the sump of divinity. Its purpose was the isolation of the grotesque and the deformed. The history of the depths is the history of the living cesspool, where the exiled mutated into monsters while feasting on the detritus of the upper city. This is the tragedy of the bottomless hunger, proving that despair is a mouth that never satiates. The lore of the gaping dragon and the eternal gluttony provides the biological foundation for this chapter's horror. Once a descendant of the everlasting dragons, this creature evolved into a living mouth due to its insatiable appetite, representing the corruption of ancient purity by physical need. The lore suggests that the gaping dragon is the icon of consumption. Its purpose was the tactical manifestation of total depravity. By sacrificing its form to eat, the dragon proved that immortality can become a deformed obsession, showing that existence without restraint is a mutation. This reveals the visceral purpose of the depths. The bottom of the world is where godhood goes to rot. This was the era of the Dragon King Great Axe. This shows that the history of the dragon is a history of the appetite, which turns a titan into a digestive organ. The physical environment of the lower Undead Berg provides insight into the urban abandonment of the fall. This is a back-alley ghetto guarded by capper demons and attack dogs, representing the security measures used to keep the filth from rising. The lore of the capper demon explains that its purpose was the implementation of domestic terror. By caging a demon in a small room, the gods proved that civilization is maintained through cruelty, showing that the law requires a leash. This reveals the claustrophobic purpose of the lower city. The berg is a funnel designed to choke the undead before they can reach the drain. This was the era of the demon Great Machete. This shows that the history of the lower berg is a history of the ghetto, which uses terror as a boundary. The relationship between Laurentius of the Great Swamp and the pyromancy of the outcast represents the primitive comfort within the fall. An exile from the swamps shares the flame of the common man, representing the democratization of power through internal will. The lore suggests that pyromancy is the fire of the poor. Its purpose was the survival strategy of the disenfranchised. By tending the flame within the hand, Laurentius proved that humanity does not need the sun to find warmth, showing that dignity is a spark kept in the dark. This reveals the warm purpose of the swamp flame. The undead finds fellowship in the ash. This was the era of the pyromancy flame. The history of Laurentius is the history of the hearth, which protects the subject from the cold. Furthermore, the lore of the butchers and the culinary horrors represents the cannibalistic desperation within the fall. These humanoid slaughterers process undead flesh into food, representing the end of social taboos in the face of eternal hunger. The lore suggests that the butchers are the custodians of the waste. Their purpose was the recycling of the cursed. By turning the failed pilgrims into meat, the depths proved that in the abyss, everything has a utility, showing that the body is only fuel. This reveals the efficient purpose of the kitchen. The gods do not feed the undead, they make them eat each other. This was the era of the sack mask. The relationship between Kirk, Knight of Thorns, and the service of the fair lady represents the vengeful compassion within the fall. A red phantom invades the depths to steal humanity, representing the necessity of theft to soothe the dying. The lore suggests that Kirk is the spiked shadow of mercy. Its purpose was the collection of souls for a suffering goddess. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the invasion. the undead must murder to heal the sacred. This was the era of the barbed straight sword. This shows that the history of the thorns is a history of the sacrifice, which turns a villain into a martyr. The lore of the basilisks and the curse of the stone represents the biological finality within the narrative. Large-eyed lizards breathe a mist that crystallizes the soul, proving that death can be permanent even for the undead. The lore suggests that curse is the ultimate silence. Its purpose was the total cessation of the cycle. By turning the warrior into stone, the depths confirmed that the dark sign has a limit, showing that the spirit can be trapped in matter. This reveals the petrifying purpose of the mist. The world wants to statue its mistakes. This was the era of the purging stone. The act concludes with the silent observation of the opening of the Blighttown door, realizing that the sewers were only the entrance to a deeper hell built on sickness and rot. The purpose of the descent into the depths lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the putrefaction. It shows that order produces waste. The player realizes that Lordran is a body with a rancid stomach. The rise of the sewer walker is the final movement of the depths lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, descent is not a direction, it is a dissolution that exposes the truth of the gods' failures. The legacy of the depths in this chapter is the horror of the biological abjection. We realize that purity was a bloody mirage and hunger was a tether that the dragon used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own consumption. The purpose of the workshop of the drains was to measure the decay, and the fall was the opening of the gate. As the slime coats the steel and the undead steps into the dark, hearing the rattle of the bones echoing through the water, they understand that the history of the depths is the history of the hunger, a hunger that consumes the world to maintain the silence of the void. The fourth chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Chosen Undead records the ecological abomination of the world's foundation. This is the narrative systemic sickness, where the physical architecture of the world, the rickety shantytowns of Blighttown and the infinite poisonous mire of the swamp, represents the physical failure of the Age of Fire. Within the toxic mists and the violent industry of the Great Wheel, the undead witnesses the excrement of Lordran. The lore of this era is the lore of the burden of the diseased. Its purpose was the geographic quarantine of the socially unclean. The history of the swamp is the history of the great stagnation, where the sunlight of Aner Londo cannot reach the shadow of the Great Wall. This is the tragedy of the silent rot, proving that divinity is a parasite that excretes its filth onto the lowest subjects. The lore of chaos, which Quelag and the sacrifice of the sisterhood, provides the biological foundation for this chapter's conflict. Once a daughter of the Witch of Izalith, she was transmuted into a spider hybrid by the failed flame, representing the corruption of motherhood. The lore suggests that Quelag is the icon of devotion. Its purpose was the protection of the dying saint. By murdering undead to steal their humanity, she proved that love can become a carnivorous reflex, showing that sacrifice without morality is a beautiful horror. This reveals the protective purpose of the Bell Domain. The witch becomes a killer to soothe the agony of the innocent. This was the era of the Quelag's Fury Sword. This shows that the history of the chaos is a history of the kinship, which turns a goddess into a predator. The physical environment of Blighttown provides insight into the vertical collapse of the fall. This is a scaffolding of despair clinging to the rock face, representing the precarious nature of mortal existence. The lore of the Blowdart snipers explains that its purpose was the tactical enforcement of the plague. By firing toxic resin from the shadows, the inhabitants proved that fear is the only defense left to the miserable, showing that the weak must be venomous to survive. This reveals the diseased purpose of the shanties. The town is a sore built to inflict attrition on the strong. This was the era of the dung pie. This shows that the history of Blighttown is a history of the infection, which uses nausea as a fortification. The relationship between the fair lady and the burden of the egg-bearers represents the tragic altruism within the fall. A silent and blind spider saint absorbs the sickness of the swamp to save the lost, representing the martyrdom of the divine. The lore suggests that the fair lady is the heart of the abyss. Its purpose was the spiritual insulation of the damned. By giving her body to the parasites, she proved that mercy requires ugliness, showing that purity exists only in total agony. This reveals the sustaining purpose of the covenant. The undead finds meaning in the service of a broken mother. This was the era of the chaos servant. The history of the daughter is the history of the sponge, which sucks the poison from the world. Furthermore, the lore of the second bell and the awakening of the gate represents the causality of the bell within the fall. By ringing the steel in the fire-choked basement, the undead triggers the mechanism of Sen's fortress, representing the approval of the ancient lords. The lore suggests that the second bell is the deep echo. Its purpose was the verification of the subject's depth. By ascending from the dregs, the undead proved that the abyss cannot hold the chosen, showing that the gate only opens to those who have walked through hell. This reveals the synchronous purpose of the toll. The gods wait for the sound of industry to invite the sacrifice. The relationship between the man-eater Mildred and the savage opportunism represents the regressive Darwinism within the fall. A cannibal spirit hunts the mire with a cleaver, representing the success of the vicious in an environment of decay. The lore suggests that Mildred is the scavenger of the sump. Its purpose was the demonstration of the primal regression. This reveals the feral purpose of the invasion. The swamp strips the undead of civilization until only the knife and the hunger remain. This was the era of the butcher knife. This shows that the history of the mire is a history of the predator, which turns man into beast. The lore of the Great Hollow and the memory of the arch trees represents the archaeological foundation within the narrative. A secret passage leads to the colossal roots of the old world, proving that Lordran is a parasite built on the corpses of trees. The lore suggests that the hollow is the internalized skepticism. Its purpose was the reveal of the cosmic architecture. By climbing the bark, the undead confirmed that the Age of Fire is a surface fiction, showing that the truth is wooden and ancient. This reveals the foundational purpose of the root. The world rests on a skeleton that does not burn. This was the era of the Chloranthy ring. The act concludes with the silent observation of the Sen's fortress gate swinging open, realizing that the swamp was only the filter for the final testing ground. The purpose of the Swamp of Sorrows lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the sickness. It shows that health is a privilege of the high. The player realizes that Blighttown is the conscience of Lordran. The rise of the Bellringer is the final movement of the swamp lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, ascent is not a reward, it is a respite from the vomit of the gods that exhausts the soul to satisfy the iron. The legacy of the swamp in this chapter is the horror of the systemic sickness. We realize that safety was a bloody delusion, and rot was a tether that Quelag used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own mortality. The purpose of the workshop of the mire was to measure the toxicity, and the fall was the ringing of the second signal. As the green gas fills the lungs and the undead steps out of the mud, hearing the clang of the gate echoing through the mist, they understand that the history of the swamp is the history of the drain, a drain that chokes the world to maintain the sanitation of the heavens. The fifth chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Chosen Undead marks the bureaucratic execution of the pilgrim. This is the narrative mechanical cruelty, where the physical architecture of the world, the swinging pendulums of Sen's fortress and the pressure plate traps of the interior represents the divine contempt for the unworthy. within the rhythmic clanking of the machinery and the pitiless heights of the fortress walls. The undead witnesses the industrialization of the trial. The lore of this era is the lore of the sifting machine. Its purpose was the physical deconstruction of the fraudulent hero. The history of the fortress is the history of the proving ground, where the House of Traps serves as the final barrier between the mortal world and the city of the gods. This is the tragedy of the automated death, proving that divinity is a fortress that grinds the applicant to bone before judging the spirit. The lore of the iron golem and the soul of the core provides the biological, or rather artificial, foundation for this chapter's climax. A colossal automaton powered by a core of bone and soul. This guardian represents the impersonal might of the ancient war. The lore suggests that the iron golem is the icon of the unfeeling guard. Its purpose was the final physical culling of the candidate. By standing at the summit with a great axe, the golem proved that might is the only visa for Aner Londo, showing that determination must be tempered in iron. This reveals the calculated purpose of the roof. The gods created a machine to end the journey of the weak. This shows that the history of the golem is a history of the barrier, which turns a test into a crematorium. The physical environment of Sen's fortress provides insight into the mathematical malice of the fall. This is a vertical funnel designed to exploit the rhythm of the infiltrator, representing the god's preference for structure over chaos. The lore of the Snake Men explains that its purpose was the biological surveillance of the gauntlet. These serpentine guardians watch the blades, proving that the gods used the kin of dragons to police their borders, showing that authority employs the primal to enforce the order. This reveals the hostile purpose of the interior. The fortress is a clockwork assassin built to shatter the mind through repetition. This shows that the history of Sens is a history of the filter, which uses geometry as a weapon. The relationship between Big Hat Logan and the hubris of the scholar represents the intellectual hunger within the fall. A master of sorcery trapped in a cage seeks the wisdom of the archive, representing the human desire to command the logic of the universe. The lore suggests that Logan is the mirror of the obsessive pursuit. Its purpose was the demonstration of the frailty of human knowledge. By waiting in the dark, Logan proved that even the greatest mind is powerless against a lock, showing that magic is a tool that fails in the face of iron. This reveals the arrogant purpose of the scholar's journey. The undead risk everything to read the script of the gods. This was the era of the Logan's catalyst. Furthermore, the lore of the giants and the industry of the fortress represents the slave labor of the divine within the fall. These enormous beings load the boulders and pull the chains, representing the utility of the titans in the service of the lordship. The lore suggests that the giants are the batteries of the machine. Their purpose was the maintenance of the gauntlet's lethality. By dropping fire and stone, they proved that the gods value function over life, showing that in the fortress, everything is disposable for the trial. This reveals the exploitative purpose of the tower. The gods used the ancient to crush the new. This was the era of the giant's halberd. The relationship between the mimics and the corruption of the reward represents the cynical betrayal within the fall. Chests that eat the greedy wait in the rooms, representing the god's mockery of the pilgrim's hope. The lore suggests that the mimic is the icon of the false prize. Its purpose was the psychological sabotage of the explorer. This reveals the cruel purpose of the fortress's loot. The gods teach the undead that desire is a death sentence. This was the era of the symbol of avarice. This shows that the history of the mimic is a history of the deception, which turns greed into gore. The lore of the Batwing demons and the final transit represents the divine extraction within the narrative. After conquering the golem, demonic messenger beasts carry the undead into the clouds, proving that the entry to the heavenly city is controlled by the monstrous. The lore suggests that the bat wings are the escorts of the sacrifice. Its purpose was the spatial elevation of the verified soul. By lifting the cursed from the iron, the demons confirmed that the trial was successful, showing that the gods only touch the winner. This reveals the invitational purpose of the flight. The sky opens for the survivor. The act concludes with the silent observation of Einerlando appearing through the mist, realizing that the fortress was only the abattoir for the final ascension. The purpose of the Sen's fortress lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the cruelty. It shows that paradise is guarded by murder. The player realizes that Lordran is a clock that ticks in blood. The rise of the Iron Climber is the final movement of the fortress lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, ascent is not a right, it is a survival that hardens the will to satisfy the mechanism. The legacy of the fortress in this chapter is the horror of the mechanical cruelty. We realize that mercy was a bloody error and structure was a tether that the golem used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own insignificance. The purpose of the workshop of the iron was to deconstruct the ego, and the fall was the arrival at the sun, as the batwings soar and the undead seize the gold of the spires, hearing the clang of the blades echoing through the valley below. They understand that the history of Sens is the history of the sieve, a sieve that catches the hero but leaves the man to fall into the abyss. The 6th chapter in our chronicle documents the optical deception of the divine peak. This is the narrative architectural gaslighting, where the physical architecture of the world, the sun-drenched spires and golden cathedrals of Einerlando, represents the desperate projection of a dying royalty. Within the blinding light and the echoing marble halls, the undead witnesses the staged majesty of a kingdom that has already fled. The lore of this era is the lore of the Golden Facade. Its purpose was the psychological preservation of the Age of Fire. The history of the city is the history of the empty throne, where a perpetual sunset hides the stagnant dark of a civilization in retreat. This is the tragedy of the beautiful lie, proving that divinity is a painting that crumbles the moment the sacrifice touches the canvas. The lore of Dragonslayer Ornstein and Executioner Smuff provides the biological foundation for this chapter's ultimate trial. Standing as the final sentinels of the cathedral, they represent the twin pillars of the old guard, one a noble knight of the sun, the other a cannibalistic outcast denied knighthood. The lore suggests that this duo is the verdict of the gods. Its purpose was the physical verification of the Lord Vessel's recipient. By fighting together in the Great Hall, they proved that the Chosen must overcome both the grace and the brutality of the divine order, showing that succession requires the defeat of the Pantheon's pride. This reveals the testing purpose of the cathedral. The lords left their dogs to guard an empty house. This was the era of the Leo ring. The physical environment of the painted world of Ariamis provides insight into the theological exile of the fall. Hidden within a colossal canvas in the cathedral, this cold and snowy refuge contains the abominations the gods feared, representing the censorship of the divine logic. The lore of Crossbreed Priscilla explains that its purpose was the prison of the untouchable. By painting a world for those who do not fit the golden narrative, the gods proved that order is maintained through exclusion. This reveals the hypocritical purpose of the city. The sun only shines because the dark has been locked in a frame. This was the era of the life hunt scythe. This shows that the history of the painting is a history of the secret, which turns art into a grave. The relationship between Gwyndolin the Dark Moon and the fabrication of the sun represents the architectural manipulation within the fall. The moon-born son of Gwyn uses illusion to maintain the image of his sister, Guinevere, and the sunlight, representing the frailty of patriarchal legacy. The lore suggests that Gwyndolin is the director of the divine play. Its purpose was the guidance of the undead toward the kiln. By creating a goddess to speak for the silence, Gwendolyn proved that hope is a tool forged in the basement, showing that the Chosen is a pawn controlled by a shadow. This reveals the cynical purpose of the sunlight. The light exerts control through awe. This was the era of the Dark Moon Blade. Furthermore, the lore of the Silver Knights and the ghostly vigil represents the residual loyalty within the fall. These armor-clad sentinels guard the empty corridors, representing the memory of a military that no longer has a king. The lore suggests that the Silver Knights are static memories. Their purpose was the maintenance of the illusion's physical weight. By firing great arrows from the ledges, they proved that the gods value distance over dialogue, showing that in the city, safety is an aggressive stance. This reveals the defensive purpose of the spires. The city kills the guest to protect the secret. This was the era of the Dragonslayer Greatbow. The relationship between the Dark Moon Tomb and the Morning of the Lord represents the funereal foundation within the fall. Hidden beneath the rotating elevator, the tomb of the great Lord Gwyn holds nothing but an empty coffin and cold stone, representing the theological void at the center of the world. The lore suggests that the tomb is the end of the lineage. Its purpose was the demonstration of the god's mortality. This reveals the ironic purpose of the cathedral. The gods built a monument to a father who is already ash. This shows that the history of the tomb is a history of the mourning, which turns worship into denial. The lore of the Lord Vessel and the transition of the soul represents the metabolic requirement within the narrative. Given by the illusion of Guinevere, this golden bowl allows the undead to warp between fires, proving that the Chosen has become the new vessel for the flame. The lore suggests that the Lord Vessel is the contract of the sacrifice. Its purpose was the mobilization of the pawn. By lifting the vessel, the undead confirmed their acceptance of the divine task, showing that the gods only grant freedom to those who carry the burden of the end. This reveals the contractual purpose of the gift. The sun gives wings to the burnable. The act concludes with the silent observation of the undead, standing before the empty throne, realizing that the gold is fading and the sun is a lie. The purpose of the Aner Londo lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the divine image. It shows that paradise is a theater. The player realizes that Lordran is a tomb dressed as a palace. The rise of the Vesselbearer is the final movement of the Aner Londo lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, ascent is not a homecoming, it is a discovery of the rot underneath the gold. The legacy of the city in this chapter is the horror of the optical deception. We realize that Maverick was a bloody puppet and light was a tether that Gwendolyn used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own sacrifice. The purpose of the Workshop of the Sun was to validate the victim, and the fall was the shattering of the illusion. As the sun sets and the undead sees the dark moon rising over the marble, hearing the echo of the gargoyles echoing through the silence, they understand that the history of Aner Londo is the history of the lie, a lie that gilds the world to hide the scream of the void. The 7th chapter in our chronicle documents the divine harvest and the dismantling of the old world's pillars. This is the narrative deicide of necessity, where the physical architecture of the world, the crystal spires of the Duke's archives, and the submerged ruins of New Londo represents the fragmentation of the original flame. Within the labyrinthine libraries and the sunken streets, the undead witnesses the moral collapse of those who once held the Lord souls. The lore of this era is the lore of the Sunder of the Crown. Its purpose was the systematic collection of cosmic fuel. The history of the harvest is the history of the final betrayal, where the Chosen must execute the gods to save the fire. This is the tragedy of the necessary murder, proving that divinity is a resource that must be reclaimed to postpone the night. The lore of Seth the Scaleless and the madness of the archives provides the biological foundation for this chapter's intellectual rot. As a dragon who betrayed his own kin, Seth was driven insane by his search for immortality, representing the corruption of genius by fear. The lore suggests that the Duke is the icon of the jealous immortality. Its purpose was the demonstration of the cost of forbidden knowledge. By kidnapping and mutating maidens into Pisacas, Seth proved that science without soul is a monstrosity, showing that the pursuit of life can result in total degradation. This reveals the academic purpose of the archives. The tower is a mind trapped in glass. This was the era of the Moonlight Greatsword. The physical environment of New Londo ruins provides insight into the political extermination of the Fall. This is a sunken city sealed by water to contain the abyss, representing the Lord's willingness to drown the innocent to stop the dark. The lore of the Four Kings explains that its purpose was the execution of the usurpers. By giving a shard of his soul to the kings, Gwyn inadvertently fueled their descent into the abyss, proving that authority is a conduit for corruption. This reveals the genocidal purpose of the seal. The gods turned a metropolis into a tomb to hide their failure. This shows that the history of New Londo is a history of the flood, which turns civilization into ghosts. The relationship between Sif, the great gray wolf, and the honor of the fallen represents the tragic loyalty within the fall. A colossal wolf guards the grave of her master, Artorias, to prevent others from falling to the abyss, representing the purity of animal devotion against human greed. The lore suggests that Sif is the sentinel of the warning. Its purpose was the physical prevention of the undead's corruption. By wielding the greatsword, Sif proved that love can defy the decay of the world, showing that the strongest barrier is a heart that refuses to forget. This reveals the mournful purpose of the forest. The gods died, but the wolf stayed. This was the era of the Hornet Ring. Furthermore, the lore of the Bed of Chaos and the Sin of Izalith represents the biological blasphemy within the fall. The Witch of Izalith attempted to duplicate the first flame, but created a cancer of flame and life, representing the hubris of creation. The lore suggests that the bed is the womb of the demonic. Its purpose was the demonstration of the uncontrollable nature of life. By transforming her daughters into monstrous insects, the witch proved that imitation is suicide, showing that the flame cannot be manufactured by the will. This reveals the chaotic purpose of the deep. The gods bred their own executioners in a lab of lava. The relationship between Gravelord Nito and the administration of death represents the quiet decay within the fall. The first of the dead slumbers in the tomb of the giants, managing the disease of mortality, representing the necessity of cessation. The lore suggests that Nito is the custodian of the end. Its purpose was the maintenance of the boundary between life and ash. By offering miasma and death, Nito proved that stability requires the stillness of the grave, showing that mercy is a blade that stops the heart. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the catacombs. The gods fear the dark, but the grave is patient. This was the era of the Blade of the Grave. The lore of the Lord Vessel satiation and the opening of the kiln represents the final transaction within the narrative. By offering the four souls to the altar, the undead breaks the divine lock, proving that the sacrifice is fully charged. The lore suggests that the Lord Vessel is the key to the furnace. Its purpose was the condensation of global power into a single point. By consuming the gods, the undead confirmed their status as the ultimate weapon, showing that the Age of Fire only survives by eating its children. This reveals the metabolic purpose of the harvest. The world grinds the high to feed the center. The act concludes with the silent observation of the undead, standing before the gates of the kiln of the first flame, realizing that they are the executioner of an era. The purpose of the Lord Slayer lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the divine deconstruction. It shows that legacy is heavy. The player realizes that Lordran is a machine that is running out of parts. The rise of the deicide is the final movement of the Harvest lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, power is not a reward, it is a burden that strips the self to satisfy the forge. The legacy of the shards in this chapter is the horror of the divine harvest. We realize that wisdom was a bloody obsession and duty was a tether that the kings used to anchor the world to the reality of the abyss. The purpose of the workshop of the harvest was to empty the heavens, and the fall was the death of the old. As the souls enter the vessel and the undead faces the final fog, hearing the rattle of the bones echoing through the empty halls, they understand that the history of Lordran is the history of the pyre, a pyre that burns the gods to maintain the illusion of the dawn. The final chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Chosen Undead records the ontological conclusion of the Age of Fire. This is the narrative cyclical finality, where the physical architecture of the world, the ashen deserts and leaning pillars of the kiln of the first flame, represents the total exhaustion of the divine order. Within the swirling embers and the white void of the world's center, the undead witnesses the death of the sun. The lore of this era is the lore of the final sacrifice. Its purpose was the sovereign determination of the cosmic direction. The history of the kiln is the history of the burnt king, where the god of sunlight has degenerated into a mindless cinder to postpone the inevitable. This is the tragedy of the hallowed lord, proving that divinity is a fuel that consumes the source to preserve the shadow. The lore of Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, and the sin of the first link provides the theological foundation for this chapter's despair. Once the king of the gods, Gwyn sacrificed his soul and body to feed the flame, representing the self-immolation of the ruling class. The lore suggests that Gwyn is the icon of the stubborn preservation. Its purpose was the demonstration of the terror of the dark. By burning until he became a hollow, Gwyn proved that authority would rather rot in flame than yield to the night, showing that the Age of Fire is a stolen century bought with the sanity of a father. This reveals the martyrdom purpose of the cinder. The Lord becomes a coal to keep the world from waking. This was the era of the Great Lord Greatsword. The physical environment of the kiln of the first flame provides insight into the metabolic exhaustion of the fall. This is a non-place constructed of ash and broken staircases, representing the end of the material reality. The lore of the Black Knights of the Kiln explains that its purpose was the final echo of the Divine Guard. These charred soldiers wander the ash, their armor burned black by the initial linking, proving that loyalty is a terminal condition. This reveals the barren purpose of the kiln. The center of the world is a dust heap where history goes to crystallize. This shows that the history of the kiln is a history of the residue, which turns glory into soot. The relationship between the ending of the link and the preservation of the stagnation represents the conservative suicide within the fall. By touching the flame, the undead explodes into cinder, representing the transfer of the curse from the god to the man. The lore suggests that linking the fire is the eternal reinforcement of the prison. Its purpose was the resetting of the global clock. By burning their soul, the undead proved that humanity is the only oil left for the divine lamp, showing that the chosen is a battery used to animate a corpse of a civilization. This reveals the sustaining purpose of the sacrifice. The sun lives because the hero dies. Furthermore, the lore of the Age of Dark and the Lord of Men represents the evolutionary rebellion within the fall. By walking away from the flame, the undead triggers the Age of Dark, representing the return of the world to its natural state. The lore suggests that the dark is the freedom of the abyss. Its purpose was the demonstration of the end of the divine mandate. By accepting the night, the undead proved that men do not need gods to define the horizon, showing that the void is the home that Gwyn taught us to fear. This reveals the liberating purpose of the departure. The undead becomes the dark lord of a silent kingdom. The relationship between the primordial serpents and the dialectic of the choice represents the manipulative duality within the fall. Frampt urges the link, while Koth urges the dark, representing the competing interests of the ancient forces in the subject's will. The lore suggests that the serpents are the architects of the illusion. Their purpose was the management of the outcome. This reveals the cynical purpose of the choice. The undead is given a path only so the world can blame the subject for the result. This shows that the history of the serpents is a history of the puppetry, which turns destiny into a conversation. The lore of the first flame and the entropy of the soul represents the thermodynamic finality within the narrative. Whether linked or darkened, the flame is fading and the soul is diluting, proving that the Age of Lords is a sinking ship that no captain can save. The lore suggests that the flame is the source of the disparity. Its purpose was the creation of the light and dark. By reaching the end, the undead confirmed that duality is collapsing into uniformity, showing that the universe always returns to the gray. This reveals the inevitable purpose of the journey. The warrior witnesses the heat, death of meaning. The act concludes with the silent observation of the undead either engulfed in fire or walking into shadow, realizing that the chosen was only a momentum in a mechanism that does not care. The purpose of the kiln lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the final void. It shows that legacy is ash. The player realizes that Lordran is a memory that is already half forgotten. The rise of the Cinder/Dark Lord is the final movement of the saga, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, choice is not a solution, it is a signature on a death warrant that satisfies the silence. The legacy of the kiln in this chapter is the horror of the cyclical finality. We realize that victory was a bloody myth and hope was a tether that the gods used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own obsolescence. The purpose of the workshop of the ash was to empty the future, and the fall was the cessation of the age. As the screen fades to black and the undead becomes a god or a coal, hearing the sigh of the wind echoing through the ashen valley, they understand that the history of Dark Souls is the history of the kindle, a kindle that burns the individual to maintain the shadow of the whole.